So, 2 years ago, I covered a case that truly sent a chill down my spine, and this was the haunting of Morgan Knudsen, based out of Canada. The story itself is harrowing, and I've been wanting to revisit this case for quite some time to fix some of the mistakes of my original video, information wise and, well, footage wise, and all of the rest. I'm doing my best to do this moving forward to properly tell these stories as best as I can. So first things first, I have fixed showing Calgary instead of Edmonton. With me not being Canadian, obviously, I had no idea for one that there was any kind of rivalry between them whatsoever. And on top of that, I think it was initially misnamed stock footage from the company that I was using then for my B-roll. So my bad on that, but that has been corrected. God only knows how many comments I received just from that one particular mistake. I do pronounce Morgan's last name properly. I know a lot of people tend to not think so, but I've watched several interviews with her and a couple different shows containing her work, and that's how I've heard it pronounced. So that's how I've pronounced it. I did also re-record and replace my previous friend's narration within the story. Albeit at that time I was really just trying to be a supportive friend, give her some exposure, but our narration styles are just very, very different. And a lot of you found that with her parts being included that it was jarring and it was taking you out of the immersion of the story. So I went ahead and re-recorded those, and those have been fixed. Lastly, I've added a couple new details that I found through additional research, and I've cleaned up the original audio quite a bit, added some new audio, and yeah, I hope you guys enjoy. So let's begin.
When we move out on our own, oftentimes there's a newfound sense of freedom, feelings of uncertainty, and happiness. Happiness that we've reached the next steps in our long journey, which is truly just beginning. But what would you do if your first residence was haunted? Would all that excitement and anticipation give way to fear, anxiety, and terror? This is the story of a woman whose experiences would come to shape the rest of her life, just as it was starting. And you'll come to see that when an entity reveals itself, it is almost always a facade of its true form. This is the untold story of a haunting in Edmonton, Canada, better known as the Morgan Knudsen Case. And this is another story you won't want to listen to in the dark. Edmonton, Canada, once a trading post, now turned modern-day metropolis, known as the gateway to the north. But among the traffic, skyscrapers, and bustling civilians, there lies other gateways within the city, gateways to dark and unholy realms. Our story begins in February of 2003 in Edmonton. 20-year-old Morgan Knudsen has finally found a home of her own. 6 months earlier, her parents had divorced and had both left the province, leaving Morgan on her own. She's never really felt like she's belonged. Surfing couches and temporary arrangements falling through were beginning to take their toll. After applying in multiple places during this time, she's finally landed a job at a computer tech support center located within the city. After a short time there, she met someone who would become one of her best friends, a man named Bob Levesque. His outgoing and friendly personality just clicked with Morgan, and from the moment they met on the floor of their job, the two almost instantly became friends. As they began to get to know each other, they would confide in one another, and it just so happened that their circumstances meant that they could help each other out. Morgan was sick of surfing couches and relying on her friends, feeling like she was a burden. And Bob, unfortunately, was going through a divorce and a custody battle during this time, and needed a new place to live. Alone, neither of them could afford to live on their own, but together, they could make the best of their circumstances. So they agreed to lift each other up, and before too long, would find an apartment that seemed to be the perfect fit. However, as we'll come to see, as their story is written, it's far from it. The two roommates were very similar in the fact that they wore their hearts on their sleeves. So as they unpacked and got settled into their new apartment, anything and everything that was special found a place. Whether it was on a shelf, on a counter, or on a wall. As they unpacked, Morgan couldn't help but notice the amount of strange-looking candles in one particular area of the living room. As she asked Bob about them, he would tell her that he was a Wiccan and that each candle held its own significance, such as one represented protection and another, love. Being agnostic, Morgan didn't care what Bob decided to pray to, but more so just found this type of religious practice fascinating. She enjoyed the physical representation of the emotions that she herself hadn't felt in months. That feeling of belonging, being protected from the outside storm, and the love of family. After explaining this to Morgan, Bob would then officially hand her a key to the apartment and proclaim the space as their home, a moment of significance for each of them. Together they would feel excited and eager to see what the future held. Several days later, as Bob and Morgan returned from a trip to the grocery store and make the trek up to the 4th floor of the complex, which is where their apartment was located, as they approach the door and start to unlock it, it's as if someone is on the other side, holding the locking mechanism. The two then begin to hear movement coming from inside the apartment, the sounds of shuffling and footsteps. Morgan rushes down the stairs and outside to check if she can see anyone inside their apartment from the outside. As she rushes out the door of the complex and out to the curb to look, she sees nothing. She quickly makes her way back into the complex and then back up the 4 flights of stairs to where her and Bob's apartment is located. Only when she gets there, there's no Bob to be seen. The front door is wide open. As she approaches it, she's soon startled by a man. Thankfully, it's Bob. He explains that he was able to get the door open somehow, and that he had heard shuffling noise coming from the apartment next door as well. But after Morgan explains that the next door apartment is vacant, Bob quickly dismisses their experience, saying that old buildings tend to creak and moan as they settle, and we probably heard nothing. Although perplexed, Morgan simply accepts this explanation, grabs the groceries from the floor, and heads inside. Later that night, as the winter moon hangs in the sky, Morgan is suddenly woken up by the sound of banging coming from the wall next to her head. Thinking Bob was awake and stumbling around, she gets up and makes her way towards the living room. As she goes to ask him if everything is all right given the hour, she walks past his room where she finds him asleep. Standing still to listen for the noises that had woken her up, she hears nothing. Once again, unsure of what to make of the situation, she is unnerved, but eventually makes her way back to her room and back to bed. Roughly a week after this night, the two friends host a moving-in party with several of their colleagues from work, hoping to cut loose with a few glasses of wine, some home-cooked dinner, and some company. They spend the night joking and laughing.
As the night progresses, a mutual friend of theirs by the name of Kate asks if anyone had any dirt to dish, to which Morgan replied with, "I haven't been seeing anyone. But at night, I keep hearing footsteps coming from my roommate's bedroom, so I'm just curious who the lucky lady is." Bob, although laughing with the group, denies seeing anyone. Especially given his circumstances, he wasn't trying to see anyone romantically. He was more concerned about seeing his 2 sons, who he hadn't seen in over 1.5 years at this point, and his heart's emotions were still too raw following the fallout that he had had with his wife, resulting in the divorce proceedings. The group soon moves on with the night, and eventually all would leave except for the hosts, Morgan and Bob. As the two clean up after the celebration, Bob asks Morgan, "Were you serious about hearing footsteps at night?" To which she replied, "Yeah, I keep hearing them, but it could just be my mind playing tricks on me." After a moment of silence, Bob replies with, "No, it's not your mind playing tricks on you. I've been hearing things too. And the other night, I saw something that I can't explain." Concerned now, Morgan would ask him to elaborate. Bob would go on to say that he believed he saw a spirit in his room the other night. He was woken up out of a sound sleep by the flickering of a light. Thinking that it was storming outside, he wiped his eyes, only to see the figure of a small boy when he opened them again. The boy was younger, resembling the age of an 8 or 9-year-old. Upon asking the boy who he was told that his name was Joseph. Ever since that night, Joseph had been visiting Bob almost nightly to talk with him. Bob, however, had been keeping this to himself until now. Upon hearing these details, Morgan was concerned, but didn't think at first that it was something paranormal. She believed it could be Bob's subconscious inventing a delusion due to the stress of him not being able to see his 2 boys during the situation he found himself in with the divorce and now an ongoing custody battle. But still, she couldn't fully remove the happenings in her own mind. From the door being locked and not wanting to open, to hearing the banging sounds and footsteps, she thought, what if the 2 were truly related somehow? As she pondered those thoughts, Bob had stepped out of the room briefly, but would return with one of his candles. Wiccans often believe that certain objects can help and strengthen their prayers, and this candle in particular was supposed to help focus the energy of the home and bring peace and harmony to all who dwelled within it. So by lighting it, he believed that it would help Joseph move on and also help calm Morgan's nerves. So focusing his intent, he does just that.
The following morning, as the 2 wake up and begin to get ready for the day, Bob heads out early since he has a doctor's appointment, while Morgan prepares to head into the office. As she heads towards the key holder, things in hand for the day, she realizes that her keys aren't there. As she sets her items down and begins to search, she feels the hair on the back of her neck start to raise up. She glances up from the couch she had been rummaging through to see the slightest glimpse of a small boy out of the corner of her eye. But as she realizes his existence, as she fully focuses on his image, he is gone. However, glancing back over to the key rack, there in their usual spot are her keys, which were not there previously. Up until this point, always having been more of a skeptic than a believer, Morgan has no way of explaining this strangeness. She knows what she saw, and she knows for a fact that her keys were indeed not there previously, but just who or what had taken them and put them back, and just who or what was this Joseph. The day would come and go, and Bob wouldn't show up for work. As Morgan showed back up to the apartment in the evening, she would find him near his shrine of sorts, struggling to light one of his candles. It was in fact the same one that he had lit previously to bring harmony to the home. Morgan would also notice that almost all of his candles were lit, but this one in particular, the wick simply would not ignite. Bob, however, seemed unfazed. He kept trying to light it over and over again. As he did this, he would tell Morgan that he was diagnosed with cancer that day, blood cancer, and that's why he didn't go into work. Devastated by this news, Morgan tries to comfort her friend, but is unexpectedly rejected. Her easygoing and friendly roommate seems angry and bitter. Hurt by this development but not wanting to make this about her, Morgan simply swallows her feelings and tries to be as supportive as she can, but Bob simply just wants to be left alone. So after failing to light the last candle, he would leave the living room and head into his room and shut the door behind him, perhaps to continue to come to terms with this devastating news. After hours apart, as Morgan prepares for bed, she passes by Bob's room, door still closed, and oddly, she hears what sounds like two people whispering inside. But despite this, she talks through the door to Bob, telling him that she's sorry and that she wants to be there for him. She is only met with rage. Bob screams at her through the door to leave him alone, and a banging noise emanates from behind the door, startling Morgan. As she backs up, she sees a black figure in the living room. As she apprehensively approaches it, it darts through a wall with incredible quickness. Its movement extinguishes the flames of Bob's candles. Morgan, both upset and scared now, has no one to talk to. Bob has isolated himself within his room, and there was no one else available. At this moment, to quell the sea of emotions, she very quietly makes her way back to her room, where she attempts to sleep for the night. As she tosses and turns, her mind begins to ponder and process these new developments. It seems like whatever force that dwelled within the apartment was getting stronger, and perhaps it was. Over the last several months, as Morgan Knudsen has been working at a computer technical support center, she has met and become acquainted with many new people and has made many new friends. One such a person was becoming a budding love interest, and his name was Courtney Clappin. Following the night of the apparition revealing itself to Morgan, and Morgan also becoming aware of Bob's cancer diagnosis, she finally decided to take Courtney up on his date proposal, something that she had been turning down for quite some time. The two would go out for dinner and drinks that evening after work, and as they enjoyed each other's company, Morgan began to confide in Courtney about some of the strange things that had been happening in her and Bob's apartment. Courtney believed Morgan thought she was experiencing something, but figured that there had to be a scientific explanation, that the paranormal was nothing more than old superstitions and ignorance. He proposed that he go with her to the apartment, that he would disprove her ghosts, and that he could even get that unlightable candle to ignite. So figuring she had nothing to lose, Morgan agrees. After the small drive, the two find themselves inside the apartment, where Courtney proceeds to begin lighting all the candles on the shrine. He is successful lighting all of them, until he reaches the one that Morgan had mentioned would not light, although she didn't tell him which one it had been. He tries for several seconds, until suddenly it does manage to light, but what happens next shocks them both. The candle suddenly begins to spark, and the flame itself shoots out from the top of the candle several feet, something which should be impossible. It then goes out. The two sit there in disbelief, when the silence is broken by Bob walking into the living room. However, he doesn't say anything. He just glares at them and simply walks away. In the months to come, Morgan and Courtney would begin dating, and although Morgan tries to be there for her friend, Bob seems to be losing himself. He no longer speaks to her. She barely sees him, and he just spends all of his time inside his room, talking to Joseph, and more disturbingly, she can hear both of them. It is not just Bob talking to himself. One night, she distinctly hears him say, "You always know just what to say when I need to hear it." This sad trend would continue for quite some time, until one morning, when Morgan wakes up to get ready for work, she is greeted by Bob, who's already dressed and cooking breakfast. Shocked but excited to see an inkling of her old friend back to his normal self, she hugs and greets him. But Bob not only seems normal again, but he seems elated. The legal proceedings have finally allowed him to be able to see his boys again. So he tells her that after work, he's headed to Saskatchewan for the weekend for some much-needed family time. Being both happy for her friend and for their relationship hopefully returning to what it used to be, Morgan wishes him a safe trip. As Bob leaves the apartment, she makes her way to the restroom to take her morning shower. As she draws the water, undresses, and begins to bathe herself, unbeknownst to her, the door to the bathroom slowly begins to creak open. As she massages her scalp with shampoo, she hears what sounds like whispering coming from behind the shower curtain. As her eyes dart towards the direction of the sound, she begins to hear dark and sinister laughing emanating behind the curtain. Then as she begins to panic, she sees gnarled and grotesque-looking hands press onto the curtain and rush towards her. She is reduced to a soaking pile of terror in the corner of the tub. And then, whatever the horrific presence was, disappeared. Although the incident only lasts seconds, it feels like an eternity. Pulling back the curtain to confirm that whatever it was gone, Morgan now comes to terms with her encounter. She didn't know what this force was, but she did know that it wanted her to be very, very scared. And she also knew deep down in the core of her being that this thing was not a child. After gathering her bearings, she felt like she had to talk to Bob. So rushing into the call center that they both worked at, she sees him and begins divulging her experience. Placing the customer he was chatting with on hold, Bob surprisingly goes on the defensive. He tells Morgan that there's no way that whatever she experienced was Joseph, that he was just a little boy. The lack of support from her friend and roommate seems to break something within Morgan, and she becomes frantic and angry. As she storms away from Bob's desk, her boyfriend Courtney rushes to her aid. However, far from being a supportive pillar to lean on, he tells her that he overheard everything she said, and that she needed to calm down, and that she's believing in something that simply doesn't exist. This is the last thing Morgan needs to hear in this moment, so without a further word, she leaves the call center. She then contemplates her next move, and decides to reach out to the only person who she thinks will understand where she's coming from and what she's dealing with, her friend Stephanie.
Upon reaching Stephanie's house, the first words out of Morgan's mouth are, "I'm scared." And who can blame her after dealing with everything that she had been through thus far? Knowing that Morgan felt as if her home was being invaded by something that she couldn't fight, and what having a home in the first place finally meant to her, Stephanie comforts her friend and then suggests something. After doing some research, she suggests that the two attempt to capture Joseph on a recording, to capture an EVP of the phenomena, to prove his existence, and try to come up with a plan of action. Neither of the two have done any work prior to this. And apprehensive at first, but not seeing any other option, Morgan agrees. The two then drive to Morgan's apartment, and with the assistance of one of the neighbors, who was a mutual friend, they are able to get Stephanie up the 4 flights of stairs, since she was disabled and wheelchair bound. After reaching the top and heading inside the apartment, with a digital recorder in hopes of capturing something useful to possibly show someone who could have the expertise to assist them further, they make their way towards Morgan's room. Within a few minutes of being inside, they hear something shatter in the living room. Walking to see what it could have been, they come across a statue that Morgan had first put up when her and Bob had moved in. A statue that symbolized just how much having a home really meant to her. It now lay in pieces on the floor. Morgan believed this to be some kind of a challenge from the entity, almost a provocation of sorts. So instead of starting in her room, she decided to begin their recording there in the living room. And as the recorder did its job, Morgan began to ask her questions. These questions ranged from, how old are you? What are you? Where did you come from? Why are you here? And why are you targeting me? Among many, the process of trying to make contact and record a response is painstaking. And after hours of attempts, after playing the recording back, they received no responses. At this point, it was very late, and although nervous about sleeping in the apartment, Morgan had the company of her friend. so the two decided to turn in for the night. This decision was also made since the mutual friend who had helped carry Stephanie up the stairs earlier in the day was also long since asleep for the night. After settling into Morgan's bed, the women drift off to dreamland, and something spectral was watching them sleep.
Around 3 a.m., both Morgan and Stephanie are woken up by the sounds of footsteps in the living room. At first they thought it was Bob, but Morgan knew that Bob had been looking forward to seeing his sons more than anything, and unless something catastrophic had taken place, there would be no reason for him to be home, let alone at 3 a.m. As Morgan turned towards the door to go and figure out just what was happening, the door to her room opened by itself. The atmosphere now grew tense. Morgan was then suddenly thrown backwards, and the door, which had creaked open on its own, now slammed shut. Stephanie frantically called out in the darkness, asking what was happening. Due to her disability, she was unable to move and was facing away from the door. Morgan could barely eke out a sentence as the door opened and slammed, and a dark, sinister laugh could be heard throughout the room, as well as the sound of heavy footsteps stomping around. Not knowing what else to do, Morgan asked Stephanie to call Courtney, since she was the closest to the phone. However, upon calling, no one answered. The two of them were now isolated, and Morgan knew that if she left her friend there to go and get outside help, that this force, could lock doors and was feeding upon their fear. It would be hard telling what it would do to Stephanie. So together, they seemingly had no choice other than to brave the storm. Terrified for the rest of the night until daybreak, around 6 a.m., the two sat in Morgan's room and were held captive by this force, which continued to open and slam doors and what sounded like cabinets, as well as ransacking the living room. At dawn, a call breaks the silence of the apartment. It's Courtney. After a brief explanation, he heads over with his help, and the three of them are able to leave. After dropping Stephanie back off at her house, the couple begins to talk. Courtney is still not convinced that the two of them really experienced anything, but regardless, he suggests that Morgan leave the apartment for several days to clear her head. However, conveniently, even after finding out that she had no other options besides him and Stephanie to stay with, he doesn't initially offer her solace at his place. Morgan, despite this and the unfolding situation of dealing with the paranormal force that was now plaguing her life, refused to give up her home, her sanctuary, to anyone, spirit or flesh and bone. She decides to go back. Upon arriving at the apartment with Courtney, the two walk in and are greeted by Bob in the living room. He seems upbeat and certainly more at peace. The trip to see his boys must have gone well. He explains that on his trip, he picked up a blessed candle that should help with things. Morgan, who had kept the digital recorder, remembered reading that changes in temperatures, even the striking of a match, could potentially trigger spiritual activity, so she decides to begin recording the interaction. Bob then, before the two of them, lights the blessed candle and then takes its flame and puts it to the wick of the candle that was to help focus the energy of the home and bring peace and harmony. The very same candle that Morgan and Courtney had attempted to light and whose flame had surged and left them with unanswered questions. It lit normally. This interaction made Courtney question just what was taking place. As Morgan began to explain to Bob what had happened the night before, he seemed completely uninterested. He simply kept smiling at his blessed candle as he carried it throughout the apartment. Courtney would later say that the Bob I knew from the workplace had a completely different personality. The Bob I encountered that day at the apartment was very odd and honestly creepy. The whole thing was strange. As Bob makes his way back into the living room and closes his door, the couple sits down at a table. Morgan explains that she had recorded the interaction and wanted to see if she had captured anything. Playing back the audio at first, they don't hear anything out of the ordinary. But as Bob ignited the original candle with the new one, a horrific and unearthly scream came through the speakers. This scream not only scared Morgan, but it also bewildered Courtney, because he was there and he knew that there was no way of faking that. The scream also served as a confirmation to Morgan that she most certainly was not dealing with the spirit of a little boy. Assessing her options, she begins to research who she could reach out to. Having seen a program a while back on TV, she remembers the name, Lorraine Warren. It takes some time, but she is able to get in contact with Lorraine. Upon explaining the situation to her, the descriptions send alarm bells ringing for Lorraine. She knows immediately that this spirit is indeed not the one of a little boy, but rather that it has put this up as a facade in order to gain entry into the apartment and into their lives, and that Morgan is not the primary target, but Bob. She believes that Bob's major shift in personality and obsession with the entity indicates that he is under demonic possession. She also believes that this took place due to the entity exploiting Bob's vulnerability, and it took the form of a child, since Bob was so desperate to spend time with his own children. She also tells Morgan that her only hope at this point is to spiritually fortify herself for protection and try and convince Bob, the real Bob, that he has to renounce Joseph and fight, and that if he refuses to renounce this entity, that ultimately there would be a tragedy within the home. The call would last for several hours. Courtney, finally convinced that something spiritual was indeed taking place, finally offers Morgan the opportunity to come and stay at his home to get away from it all. But she didn't want to give up on Bob. So upon Courtney departing for the night, Morgan turns around to face the horror within. As she slowly walks back into the apartment and towards Bob's room, she realizes that his door is now open, and Bob is within a circle of candles upon the floor, seemingly within a trance. She tells him, "I know how I can make things right again, but we have to get a priest." As the words leave her lips, they're met with an angry no from Bob. And for a split second, although Bob is seething, she sees a glimpse of her old friend, but just for that small sliver of time. Although reluctant, no doubt, Bob agrees to accept her help. The following morning, she drives him to a local Catholic church in hopes of getting assistance there at the recommendation of Lorraine Warren. However, upon seeing the church, Bob refuses to go in. Losing hope, but still determined, Morgan continues onward and meets with a priest there. At the priest's recommendation, she's told to display holy objects throughout the home in an effort to repel any evil that could be dwelling there, and to recite the prayer of Saint Benedict, the patron saint of the poisoned. And poisoned he believed Bob to be, given the story that he was told. The priest wanted to assist further, but without the permission of Bob and an in-person meeting, he would not be able to do so. Later that evening, Morgan begins to place crucifixes throughout the hallways of the apartment home. As she toils away, hanging each one with care and intent, she is soon greeted by Bob. He stepped out of the shadows at the end of the hallway. She had not heard him previously leave his room. He begins to scream at her, demanding that she take the crucifixes down. The person she sees, she no longer recognizes. As she stands her ground, Bob, staring at the cross, suddenly begins to weep. And for another brief moment, the Bob she once knew seems to come through once again. He explains through the tears that he knows that something isn't right, that it's not the cancer diagnosis, that there's something dark and angry residing within him, but that he doesn't know what to do. As Morgan drops her guard to try and comfort her friend, explaining to him that maybe if he just told Joseph no for one night, that perhaps they could start to fix this. When these words left her lips, there was another shift within Bob. He went back into an angry state, yelling that she needed to stop talking about things that she knew nothing about. As he storms off, headed back to his room, Morgan, in tears herself now, heads into the kitchen. As she attempts to gather herself, all of the dishes in the cabinets, begin to shake. Suddenly, a cabinet flies open and a plate is thrown by an unseen force. It hits Morgan in the head, cutting her open. Screaming, she flees the apartment. She would find solace with Courtney that night. As she tosses and turns trying to sleep, she can't help but feel obligated to Bob, as she wants to try and follow through what she had discussed with the priest and Lorraine Warren in hopes of freeing him from whatever this entity was. Several nights later, she finally convinces Court to help her by reciting the prayer of St. Benedict within the apartment. As the two sit down at a table in the living room and begin praying, the table itself begins to shake. As they deepen in their efforts, almost everything around them is in motion. Objects are shaking and floating, moving of their own accord. They repeat the prayer multiple times and soon become too frightened to continue given the escalation and activity taking place. Morgan runs to Bob's door and pleads for him to leave the apartment, but there's no answer. Following the events of this night, Morgan would stay the next 2 weeks with Courtney at his home. During this time, the two of them would decide that it was for the best for her to move in with him permanently. She, however, would need to retrieve her belongings from the apartment. When the day comes, not wanting to have Bob present due to his rising instability and hostility alongside the paranormal force, Morgan waits for a phone call from Courtney, who is on the floor at their job. Once Bob arrives at work for the day, he gives her the call, which is the signal she's been waiting for to head to the apartment to move out. Upon arriving, Morgan opens the door to the apartment and is greeted with a bone-chilling cold rush of air as she steps inside. Quickly getting to work, she begins to round up her things. Although there's an eerie feeling in the air, nothing is manifesting. Meanwhile, at the call center, Bob has gone missing. This sends up a red flag to Courtney when he happens to notice. When he finds out he's been gone for over an hour, he rushes to call Morgan. However, his call would fall upon deaf ears. Her phone had been left inside of her car. Back at the apartment, Morgan finishes packing the last of her home's keepsakes from the shelf in the living room that she had put up when they had first moved in. She only has one box full of belongings. It's not much, but it's all she's got. As she takes one last look at the apartment, savoring the situation as a whole, she turns around to approach the door to make her final exit. The door opens. It's Bob. He's pale, sweating, and looks like a shadow of his former self. He immediately goes on the defensive. He gets in her face and starts grilling her on what she's doing, but Morgan refuses to cower.
She calmly tells Bob that she still cares for him, but that she can't help him anymore, and if he can't help himself, by renouncing Joseph. Bob throws back a seething reply. He doesn't need me. I need him. Take your trinkets with you. Your God didn't save him anyways. Bursting into tears, Morgan grabs her box to leave, but blocking the door is the apparition of a child. It's Joseph. However, he begins to morph into something grotesque. A mangled monstrosity, inhuman and abhorrent. Morgan later described the creature as having black eyes, gnarled fangs, and gray, dead skin. When the creature dissipates, seemingly within seconds, Morgan leaves. The last sound she hears is the whispers of a little boy talking to Bob in his room. She leaves knowing there's nothing more she could have done.
After this day, Bob never shows up to work again. He moves out of the apartment, but leaves no forwarding address. His whereabouts and fate are unknown. Morgan and Courtney continued to date for the next 4 years following the events mentioned in this video. However, I was unable to confirm if they are still together. Morgan and Stephanie would eventually combine their intrigue for the supernatural to found Entity Seeker, an agency that helps people find assistance who are in danger by the paranormal. They didn't want anyone to feel helpless like they did, ultimately using their experiences to bring positivity into the world. To this day, Morgan continues to run Entity Seeker and has been involved in numerous investigations and shows, as well as writing several books. If you're interested in her works, I'll leave links in the description below. This entire case to me is very intriguing. It just goes to show that the paranormal can affect anyone and everyone, regardless of location and circumstances. That if such a thing as demons exist, that they'll take advantage of the weakest beings in the most vulnerable states, such as Bob, exploiting his feelings and imperfections to take possession of his very soul for its own ends. I also think that it showcases the humanity of Morgan and how these types of situations can affect your day-to-day life, but that she also shows how one can grow and make the best of said situations and use their experiences to help assist others in need. All observations aside, have you ever lived in a haunted home? And what if that home was your first? How would that affect you the rest of your days? And how would you have handled a situation like what Morgan found herself in with Bob? Let me know in the comments below. And just know that if a spirit or entity reveals itself to you, more often than not, the figure it presents isn't always its true form. That underneath that innocent facade could indeed be a twisted and demonic creature, stalking and waiting to break you down and take control. Be aware and don't let it be you.
Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I know it was a mix of new information and fixes with the older video storytelling and a little bit of new storytelling as well. But this is now, to my knowledge, as accurate as I can get the story, which is important to me. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like, subscribe if you're new here, hype and comment your thoughts down below. Consider becoming a channel member or subscribing to my Patreon, or visiting my merch store on screen now or in the description below. I appreciate you guys. Let me know if you want more videos like this, if there are things to fix or revisit, and to add to older videos in particular. I'd be happy to do it. Until next time, this has been Cody here at Mystery Archives. Stay safe out there, and take care.